Forgotten City, Chapter 21. Kobe managed a few more steps across the rooftop, then dropped to his knees, eyes drinking in the vista. A breeze chilled his skin. He could see people in the streets below, hundreds of them walking across clean sidewalks, crossing the roads under flashing stop signs, as cars with impossibly reflective skins threaded almost soundlessly around bends, occasionally rising over one another, or climbing into the air and joining the other flying traffic, looking like sparkling mirrors. It can't be. I must be seeing things. They've done something to me. Kobe was aware of the landing pad descending behind him and the shouts of the guardians, but he didn't have any inclination to move. He touched the asphalt of the roof with his fingertips. If this was a dream, it felt very real. He could feel the breeze on his face and hear 1,000 tiny noises coming from the city below. Every second of every day of his conscious existence, he'd believed the waste was all there was. Everything he had thought was a lie. A glance at Asha told him this was no hallucination, and she was surprised, or as surprised as he was. "Did you know about this?" She didn't answer. Her mouth was hanging open, and she walked past him closer to the edge. And as the sense of wonder throbbed through him, he felt like a fool. Because, really, the clues had been there all along. He'd spent so long petrified by the Snatchers, he'd never stopped to think how strange they were, how otherworldly, their technology way in advance of any of the Detrius left within the waste-ravaged city. The Claw's weapons, their transport, all of it several years ahead of anything he'd come across in the ruins. It should have been clear. The world outside his green bubble had moved on. He felt a piece of fabric being draped over him and a hand rest softly between his shoulder blades. 2 guardians ran forward and took hold of Asha's arms. She didn't protest. Her expression was one of pure bewilderment. "It must be a shock," said Melanie Garcia. Kobe turned to look up at her. She, too, was staring across the cityscape, the gust catching a few stray strands of hair. Kobe stood up slowly. He had on some sort of robe and pulled it tighter around him. The remainder of the guardians had stopped back near the hatch, their weapons lowered. The man, called Krenner, stood slightly forward, his arms folded and a fierce look on his face. "Welcome to New Seattle," replied Melanie. "New Seattle?" Melanie pointed off the rooftop to their left. "The old city is that way, about 200 miles. It's surrounded by a quarantine zone 20 miles wide. They dropped so many nukes, nothing will grow there for 500,000 years." Kobe shook his head to try to clear it. "So the waste is contained in the old Seattle?" Melanie laughed bitterly. "I'm afraid not. The waste is everywhere, every continent. It's a war on 1,000 fronts that we can never win. But we have our enclaves like this one, places built by the survivors. And even if we can't win, we don't have to lose." Asha began to pull away from the guardians, her focus sharpened on Melanie. "You lied to us!" Though she struggled, they held her firmly. "Let me go," she said. "I'm going to tell them all." "We had to limit your knowledge," said Melanie, a little desperately. "If you'd known, you'd want to leave." "You don't say," said Asha. "So we're prisoners." "Your patients," said Melanie firmly. "We're trying to make you better. The waste hasn't killed you. If we could find out why, we can save the human species." "Patients or guinea pigs?" said Asha. Melanie's skin flushed a little. "That's what I thought. Claws develops medicine that have helped millions of people," said Melanie. "You make that possible, and you," she turned to Kobe, "you might be the miracle we've been looking for." Kobe understood, sort of. "Because I'm immune," he said, "that's why you wanted to find me." "Correct," said Melanie. "You can help us, Kobe. Help the world." Kobe frowned. "I'm fed up with being lied to." "You're not the only one," grumbled Asha, glaring ahead at Melanie. "You should have told us." The director nodded. "Yes," she nodded to the guards. "Let's go inside, shall we?" Back in Melanie's office in clean jumpsuits, he and Asha sat side by side as Melanie had her back to them. She persuaded Asha not to say anything yet, but Kobe could feel her bristling, ready to explode. The window, which he now knew was nothing more than a projection, showed a beautiful mountain scene. A A stag strutted under a glade of trees, and a waterfall tumbled into a sparkling pool. Melanie touched the corner of the window, and the view changed in a blink to a modern city. Cars zipped past, hundreds of feet up. Kobe saw a holo ad displayed from some kind of drone. Or a holo ad. Oh, yeah. Kobe saw a holo ad displayed from some kind of drone. It showed a family facing each other at a table while they ate from cardboard cartons with chopsticks. The sight made him, for a split second, unbearably sad. The director folded her arms and faced them. Asha has a point, she said. We should have told all of our patients about the real world a long time ago. The longer you live a lie, the harder it is to tell the truth. You were all babies at first, then toddlers. It never seemed the right time, and later we weren't sure of any of the damage it might cause to pull the curtain away. Asha grunted, clearly unconvinced. The director continued to speak. The work we do here is all that keeps this city alive, she said, waving a hand toward the outside. We create all kinds of anti-waste products. The sprays that kill waste-carrying spores that are used on any goods coming into the city on trains or planes. Medicines that help stop waste entering the body. We help treat those infected, extending their lifespans, quarantining them in areas at the edge of the city. We produce detergent with anti-spore chemicals. We help protect food supplies. We help the government manufacture drones that sweep for contamination in our streets. We quarantine the wastelands like Seattle, New York Strait, Louisiana, and most of the South. Michigan. We're everything. The research we carry out with our patients makes it all possible. She looked imploringly at Asha, who turned away. Kobe really wasn't sure what made the lie okay either, but he didn't know what to say. He kept looking outside. A week ago, he'd thought he was alone. 3 days back, he'd found out there were others, and now? How many people live here, he asked. Just under 3 million, said Melanie. Kobe sucked in a breath. He couldn't even imagine what such a number looked like. Again, Melanie addressed herself to Asha. We were worried that if you found out the psychological burden of knowing how important you were, it might be too much. Whatever, said Asha. She nodded at the outside world. Do they all know about us? Melanie pursed her lips. A few, she said. It's sensitive information. You don't say, said Asha. You need to be honest with other kids, with everyone. Melanie wore a pained expression. Ask yourself, Asha, what would that gain? The truth? Said Kobe. Melanie's jaw tightened. Perhaps you don't understand, she said. Telling the other patients is one thing. There's no chance they can ever leave. They'd know what was out there, but they could never experience it. But if the general population knew about you, about actual waste-infected individuals in the heart of their supposedly safe city, her eyes flashed dangerously. There's really no saying what might happen. Is that a threat? Said Asha, half standing. It's reality, said Melanie. Fear and ignorance are just as dangerous as any disease. Kobe watched the shifting emotions on Asha's face. But, said Melanie, suddenly more brightly, if Kobe's blood samples confirm that he's as resilient as we suspect, this whole subterfuge might be academic. We could, and I pray it's true, we could be near to eradicating the waste completely. Her gaze went over their heads. Speaking of which, a woman in a lab coat knocked and entered, carrying a touchpad. She barely looked at Kobe. Dr. Garcia, she said, a little breathlessly. I've got those results you wanted. And? Asked Melanie. The scientist looked meaningfully at Kobe. Are you sure you wouldn't rather talk in private? No need, Ruth, said Melanie. I think Kobe deserves to hear. Asha, too. The scientist nodded and tapped her screen. At the same time, the desk display changed. There were several graphics that Kobe didn't understand, with incomprehensible units on the axis. The header read, Epidemiology, samples from subject S374. As you see, said Ruth, S374's blood shows no ill effects whatsoever from the waste infection. She glanced at Kobe, then flicked onto a new page with a close-up of what looked like blobs. However, cell cultures show that he does carry a mutated form of the waste proteins in his DNA, which forms a barrier against waste. It looks like his immune system has metabolized them, rendering their carcinogenic properties impotent. He retains the benefits of infection, able to harness the same strength and enhanced abilities of other subjects, but without the detrimental effects. Fascinating, said Melanie, but without much enthusiasm. Ruth moved to a file that read S591, which showed an up-to-date image of Theon. Hales did some remarkable work, she said. He managed to isolate Kobe's antibodies into a solution that would be accepted by any host body. The antibodies effectively wipe out waste from a subject's body. It seems it lasts only as long as the antibodies stay in the bloodstream, a few days, after which recontamination is possible. We've carried out routine analysis on S591. His waste count is negligible. We're only in the early stages of investigating how that can be, but it looks like the anti-waste cleanser Hales developed is a long way in advance of our own. It is entirely effective. So Theon's going to be okay, said Asha. Better than okay, said Ruth. If he avoids contamination, he is entirely cured. No need for repeat doses or any kind of prolonged drug program. So one dose, and everyone will be better again, said Melanie. As long as they stay in the quarantine city, one step away from a permanent cure when we won't have to worry about waste at all anymore. Her eyes flicked, lizard-like, from the screen to the other scientist. The scientist's hands were shaking. It appears so, Doctor. Melanie Garcia seemed to be in shock, glued to the spot like a statue, but finally she blinked a few times. As you said, a remarkable achievement. We'll need to run more tests, a lot more tests. Melanie nodded and grinned widely, showing perfect white teeth. Let's take this slowly and strictly confidential for the moment. No one outside your team is to know. Kobe, I'm afraid we'll need to take some more blood. Enough for some continued testing. Is that all right? Of course, said Kobe. Melanie touched her lapel. Assemble a medical team on the infirmary level. Omega protocols. Ruth, I could take things from here. What does that mean? Wait a minute, said Kobe. Kobe, don't you see, said Melanie as Ruth left the room. You're the key to all of this. It's your antibody capabilities at the heart of everything. We're not taking any chances with your welfare. We need to wrap you in cotton wool. I guess so, said Kobe. How long will it take? 24 hours tops, just until we're sure what we're dealing with. She gripped his shoulders firmly. How does it feel to be the most important person on the planet? 3 days ago, I thought I was the only person, along with my dad. Melanie laughed for the first time since he'd met her, and it sounded as brittle as broken glass. A few minutes later, Kobe was back in the elevator, this time with Melanie and the man called Krenner, and one other guardian. No one spoke at all. He really wished Asha were there too, but she was back in the dorms, having promised to keep her new secret under wraps. Kobe felt like there was a weight pressing down on him now that he knew the truth, all of it. He realized how much they were relying on him. The doors opened onto the infirmary floor, and Melanie took him past the room where Theon stood behind the glass. Kobe managed a brief wave. He thought at first they were going all the way to Dr. Hale's chamber, but they stopped and entered a ward on the other side of the corridor with 4 beds. Inside, a team of 3 doctors, their faces covered in masks, had already gathered around a gurney. A trolley stood beside the bed with the glint of the tools just visible beneath a covering sheet. Make yourself comfortable, said Melanie. Kobe climbed slowly onto the gurney. She sounded businesslike, but there was an urgency in her voice, almost like fear. Why wouldn't she look at him? What are we doing again? He asked. One of the doctors lifted a syringe. We'll be injecting a dye marker into your bloodstream first, he said. It will help us find what we're looking for when we extract the antibodies. Will it hurt? Not at all, said the scientist. Just lie back and relax. Kobe did as he was told, but looked away as the doctor approached. Don't like needles, he said. Who does? Said Melanie. He felt the prick and then an icy feeling coursing up his arm. "Oh," he said, "it's cold." "It will be," said the doctor. Kobe began to relax. The gurney bed was actually comfier than it looked. "So what will you do with the wolf?" he asked. "Can you cure it too?" "I expect so," said Melanie. Again, her voice sounded off, like she wasn't really listening properly. "It saved our lives," said Kobe. "So I've heard," said Melanie. "A remarkable story." He tried to lift his head to look at her, but he couldn't. His neck felt heavy. "Something's funny," he said, and he heard that his own voice was slurred. He was drooling. "Nothing to worry about," said the doctor. "You can go now," said Melanie. "Yes, director," said one of the doctors. A pause. "Someone should monitor the drip, though." "We'll take care of that," said Melanie. "Would you like us to—" "I'd like you to leave," said Melanie curtly. "Yes, director." Kobe heard instruments being put down, then the suction of the door. His head flopped sideways. He tried to move, but everything was a dead weight. His heart rate quickened. "What are you doing?" he said, but it came out, "What are you doing?" And he couldn't straighten his head at all. He watched helplessly as an IV tube was taped to the side of his elbow. Then Melanie appeared, crouching beside the bed. Her face was grim, and he saw the future in her emotionless eyes. "Don't take this personally, Kobe, but Claus is doing very nicely providing drugs to keep people healthy. A cure doesn't really fit into our corporate strategy." She stood up and moved out of his eye line, but he could still hear her perfectly clearly. "Can I leave this in your capable hands?" "Of course, ma'am," said Krenner. Kobe wanted to scream and thrash and attack. He wanted to run, but as he tried to speak again, it was like pushing against a door that wouldn't move. Whatever drug the IV was feeding him kept him in a permanent state of paralysis, a limp body on the gurney. And though he was completely motionless, his mind raged with such turmoil it felt like his brain might explode. Who was lying to him and who was telling the truth? He wanted to be away, back at school with the man who was not his father, but who had never shown him anything but love. Back when the world made sense. He realized now. His father, Hales, did love him. He was protecting him from these people, from Claus and Melanie, and Kobe had failed him.